You've heard of cities burned by enemies, but what if the fire came not from the outside, but from within? What if the ones holding the torches wore crosses and claimed to speak for God? In the summer of 1209, an army of holy men marched into a peaceful town, not to defend it, not to save it, but to burn it to ash in the name of Christ. When they reached the gates of Béziers, the soldiers hesitated. Inside were not just heretics, but fellow Christians, children, priests, and the elderly. They asked their commander how to tell the faithful from the damned. His answer, "Kill them all, God will know his own." And with that single sentence, the flames were lit. By the end of that day, the streets were wet with blood. The cathedral collapsed under its own smoke, and a city, Christian by every name, was gone. This was not a pagan slaughter. This was not a war of empires. This was a holy execution, a crusade not in Jerusalem, but in the heart of Europe. What happened at Béziers wasn't the first time faith turned to fire, and it would not be the last. What if the purest light is what the church fears most? Long before the first torch touched Béziers, before the screams echoed through holy stone, there was only silence, and in that silence, a different kind of faith. The Cathars never built grand cathedrals. They didn't crown kings. They didn't sell indulgences or hoard relics. They fasted, lived simply, preached that the material world was the prison of the soul. To them, Christ had no need for gold, no need for Rome, no need for blood. They called themselves the good Christians, but the church had another word for them: heretics, and not just heretics to be debated or converted, but to be erased. Because the Cathars posed a threat far more dangerous than rebellion, they were beloved. Entire towns in Languedoc, like Béziers, sheltered them openly. Fathers, daughters, priests, merchants, they listened to Cathar sermons, protected Cathar perfecti, and slowly turned away from Rome. Not because they hated the church, but because they had tasted something else, something that felt closer to truth, and that was the real danger. A bishop in Paris once warned, "The Cathar heresy spreads like a fine perfume. You do not see it, but soon everyone smells it." They rejected the cross as a symbol of death. They believed the material world was crafted by an evil force, and that the true God existed only in spirit. To Rome, this was blasphemy. But to the people of southern France, it was clarity. In a world ruled by corrupt nobles and greedy priests, the Cathars offered dignity through denial, salvation through simplicity. And that's why Béziers refused to surrender them. The city's leaders, most of them faithful Catholics, still chose to protect their Cathar neighbors, not out of defiance, out of conscience. But there's a quiet irony stitched into every tragedy. The Cathars never raised armies, never called for war. They didn't believe in violence. They believed in purity, in rejection, in ascension beyond flesh. And so, when the army of God came for them, they had nothing to hold but prayer. And in that moment, purity became their curse. Because in the eyes of the church, a heretic with no sword is still more dangerous than 1,000 heathens with blades. And Rome had made up its mind. If salvation could not be enforced, it would be manufactured by fire. Just across the hills, the banners of the cross had already begun to gather, not in silence, but in judgment. Not all crusades begin with drums. Some begin with fear, whispered in Latin behind locked cathedral doors. To the Vatican, Heresy was never a matter of theology, it was infection. And Béziers, with its tolerance and its silence, was not a town, it was a wound. But a wound can be cauterized, so they reached for the flame. Pope Innocent III didn't need armies to see it. He felt it, the slip. The south of France no longer bent the knee like the north. The bishops there grew soft, the nobles too generous. In the land of vineyards and lyric poets, something was unraveling: obedience. And for a church that ruled through ritual and blood, that was treason of the soul. So he sharpened his pen. In 1208, his papal legate was murdered, stabbed in the back on the road, somewhere between Toulouse and the sea. No one confessed. No one saw, but it didn't matter. The murder was providence, an excuse wrapped in martyrdom. Innocent III wrote his response like a man possessed. Let the sword of the faithful cleanse the Lord's vineyard. But he didn't summon priests. He summoned knights. He didn't preach penance. He promised land. This was the twist. The war that followed wasn't driven by monks and martyrs. It was driven by barons, northern lords hungry for southern soil. The Pope gave them something the battlefield never had before: eternal absolution in exchange for genocide. To them, the Cathars weren't a puzzle to solve, they were a door. Behind it, titles, vineyards, castles, all yours. Just kill what's inside, and if your blade slips through an innocent, God will sort it out. This wasn't a holy war, it was a holy purge. Crusade by declaration, conquest by design. And so they came, from Champagne, Burgundy, the Loire. Men who had never stepped foot in Languedoc now marched south in gleaming mail, bearing crosses stitched in blood-red thread, ready to fight not for Jerusalem, but for Béziers. They called it a crusade. But it was never about saving souls. It was about extinguishing choice. And as their army pressed toward the walls of Béziers, the smoke of piety thickened, not in the heavens, but in men's lungs. What was coming wasn't a war. It was a sentence, and the city had only days left to breathe. The road to Béziers was not paved with stone. It was paved with sermons, silence, and the scent of opportunity. By midsummer 1209, the army of God no longer resembled martyrs on pilgrimage. They looked like wolves in priestly skin, 10,000 strong, maybe more, lords from the north, mercenaries from the Rhine, zealots who had never even heard of Catharism, but all branded with the same blood-red cross sewn into their tunics. This was no longer a crusade, it was a feeding. They marched not with hymns, but with contracts. The Pope had promised them not only salvation, but plunder. Gold, land, absolution, each sin forgiven in advance, provided it dripped with heretic blood. The language of heaven was rewritten in terms of property, and yet there was no foreign enemy to confront, no infidel fortress, no desert heat, only vineyards, stone villages, and quiet churches. This wasn't Jerusalem, it was home. But the church had decided, if the cancer was internal, the knife must go deeper. They arrived at the gates of Béziers like judges at the edge of a trial that had already been decided. The people inside, Cathars, Catholics, children, even priests loyal to Rome, had already been folded into the same sentence: heretic, not because they had confessed, but because they had stayed. The commander of the crusading host, a nobleman named Simon de Montfort, knew exactly what was at stake. His men did not understand the doctrine. They didn't need to. They had orders, they had blessings, and they had a hunger that had not seen battle since the Holy Land. This wasn't a mission to protect faith, it was a baptism in fear. But Béziers didn't tremble, its gates held. And that, more than any dogma, was the final insult. Because in the eyes of Rome, faith could be debated, but resistance could only be crushed. The Crusaders made their camp. Arnaud Amalric, the abbot in papal command, held mass. And from his lips came no sermon of peace, only thunder. Spare none, for the Lord shall recognize his own. The siege had not yet begun, but the execution had already been written. And inside the walls of Béziers, the people were preparing, not for victory, but for sacrifice. Some walls don't fall from force, they fall from conviction and take everyone behind them down. The Crusaders expected fear. They had been told the south was soft, that Béziers would break at the sight of banners, but the gates did not open. No Cathars were handed over, no compromise came crawling. The people, those so-called heretics and so-called loyalists, stood together in the same stone silence, and that defiance, more than any sword, was what lit the fuse. Inside Béziers, no one was pretending the world hadn't shifted. They knew what the red crosses meant. They saw the smoke from 1,000 cookfires rising beyond the vineyards. They heard the hymns twisted into war chants. But still they chose not to divide. The Catholics could have saved themselves. All they had to do was point, but they didn't. Instead, they stayed with neighbors, with family, with the heretics. And that was the real heresy. Because in the eyes of the church, it was Catharism that needed killing, it was solidarity. The city was not fortified like Paris or Lyon. Its walls were old, humble, its militia small, its defenders untrained. They had no illusion of victory, but what they did have was something the Crusaders had already lost, the ability to see the human beneath the label, and that made Béziers untouchable until it was. Then came the spark. A group of Crusaders, drunk and restless, approached one of the city gates, mocking, prodding, perhaps testing the nerve. What happened next was never written clearly. Some say a fight broke out, others say a gate was accidentally left ajar. But in a blink, the Crusaders surged inside. No trumpet, no order, just chaos, blood, and fire. The commanders hadn't even begun the siege, but the mob didn't care. They spilled into the streets like a divine flood, unthinking and unmerciful. The city that had chosen unity found itself drowning in it. Children clutched parents, priests clutched crucifixes, Cathars clutched prayers, none of it mattered. Once the gates fell, the crusade ceased to be an army. It became a ritual, one soaked in smoke and bone. And above the carnage, Arnaud Amalric watched, then turned to a soldier who hesitated, blade still shaking, and gave the words that would brand this day into eternity. There are commands given in war, and then there are commands that rip open the soul of history. As flames licked the thresholds of Béziers, as blood puddled in the alleys and church bells clanged in panic, a young crusader, face pale, sword still clean, turned to the papal legate, Arnaud Amalric, and asked the unthinkable. What do we do with the faithful? There were Catholics inside, loyal ones, children baptized in Rome, priests ordained by the church. Surely not them. Amalric didn't blink. Kill them all, God will know his own. It was not strategy, it was theology weaponized, certainty made flesh. In that moment, the city was not divided into heretics and innocents. There was only fire and those it would take. The soldiers obeyed, not because they believed, but because belief was no longer required. When the highest voice in the chain of command speaks for God, the sword no longer carries guilt, only momentum. Béziers became a slaughterhouse disguised as a sanctuary. The Church of St. Mary, once a place of refuge, became a trap. Hundreds had fled into it, Cathars, Catholics, clergy, beggars, clinging to the altar as if the stones would remember mercy. The Crusaders barred the doors, then torched it. Witnesses later described the screams as inhuman, not because they were monstrous, but because they were too human, too raw, too real. The kind of sound that claws out from the chest when faith finally realizes it will not be spared. And outside, the streets fared no better. Babies dashed against walls, old women dragged by their hair into the fire. Livestock stabbed out of boredom. No question was asked. No plea was heard, not because the killers were deaf, but because they had been blessed. By nightfall, the city no longer resisted, because the city no longer existed. Estimates vary: 7,000, 10,000, 20,000, none of it matters. What mattered was that no one was spared, and those who burned didn't burn as heretics. They burned as a warning, a message carved into smoke. When Rome calls for purity, it does not cleanse, it consumes. But the horror wasn't over, it was only shifting shape. Because in Béziers, the killing was done with blades and torches, but in what came next, it would be done with silence. Some places are built for worship, others become altars for execution. The Church of St. Mary didn't collapse under age or neglect. It collapsed under the weight of bodies pressed against its doors, piled beneath its vaulted ceiling, screaming for a salvation that never came. The flames didn't start there, but they ended there, and they ended clean. Eyewitnesses, those who lived long enough to regret it, said the heat blistered stone, that the stained glass saints melted like wax, that the sound inside was not human wailing, but something deeper, like a city confessing itself in fire. They had come for protection, but sanctuary had no voice that day, just walls and wood and fuel. Outside, the holy slaughter moved without rhythm, without mercy. Crusaders kicked down doors not to search, but to cleanse. A boy was dragged from a wine cellar, stabbed not once, but 13 times, once for every apostle, they joked. A nun was found hanging from the bell tower, her habit soaked in blood and ash. No one claimed responsibility. They didn't have to. The red cross on every tunic was explanation enough. They called it divine justice. But justice does not humiliate before it kills. It doesn't force mothers to watch their children burn. It doesn't laugh as it cuts. That's not retribution, that's a performance. And in Béziers, God was not watching, but men were. And they didn't blink. As night fell, silence took the city like a second wave. There were no more screams because there were no more throats to scream with. The cathedral was now a husk. The streets wet. The air thick with cooked flesh and incense smoke. From the riverbanks to the cemetery wall, there was no line between battlefield and altar. Just death, pretending to be holy. And yet, not a single Cathar army had ever taken up arms. No heretic had burned a church. No rebel banner had flown over Béziers. The slaughter wasn't revenge, it was doctrine fulfilled. But what made it truly monstrous wasn't just the killing. It was how cleanly it fit into Rome's plan, how quiet the aftermath would become, and how faith, once twisted, doesn't need a sword to keep killing. It just needs silence dressed as righteousness. What burns once leaves ash, but what burns in the name of God becomes law. When Béziers was reduced to silence, the church didn't flinch. There was no apology, no pause. Instead, a letter was sent. From Arnaud Amalric, the abbot who had watched it all from the hillside. In it, he reported the victory to Pope Innocent III with chilling precision. Our men spared no one. The total killed was about 20,000. No remorse, no hesitation, just numbers, rounded clean. Because the act wasn't seen as excess, it was seen as proof. Proof that faith could be enforced not through miracles, but through fear. That the wrath of God could be franchised, handed down in mail and steel. That holiness didn't require compassion, just certainty. This was the true crusade, not against Cathars, not even against heresy, but against doubt. Against the human instinct to ask why burn a city, why murder the innocent, why claim heaven with hands soaked in filth. The church had an answer for all of it, because God wills it. It wasn't just the dead who were silenced. It was the living. In the towns that watched Béziers go dark, a new theology spread, not from pulpits, but from smoke. The theology of survival. Conform, bow, point to your neighbor if you must, but never question. Because questioning smelled like ash now, even priests began to shift. Some stopped invoking Christ in the streets. Others quietly removed Cathar sympathies from their sermons. Bishops who had once spoken of peace began preaching fire. Not because they believed it, but because they saw what happened to those who didn't. This is how belief becomes blade. It doesn't start with hate, it starts with fear of being next. And that was the church's most powerful doctrine, not scripture, not revelation, but the knowledge that one man with a torch, acting in God's name, could change the behavior of thousands. The flames of Béziers were visible for miles, but what they ignited wasn't a war. It was a silence so heavy, it rang like a bell across southern France, one that no one dared answer. Yet behind that silence, one figure remained, the man who uttered the words that gave birth to the massacre, the man who claimed to speak for God, and whose soul, if ever weighed, would tip the scales in blood. Some men raised their hands in prayer, others raised them and cities fall. Arnaud Amalric was not a general. He wore no armor, carried no sword. His power came from something colder, proximity to God, or at least the illusion of it. When Béziers burned, he did not weep, he chronicled, and in every word he made it clear, this was not a massacre, it was a triumph. He was a Cistercian abbot, a creature of parchment and decree, yet his voice killed more than steel ever could. He never touched a torch, he didn't have to. His command, kill them all, God will know his own, was not a scream, it was calm, measured, issued like a clerical note approving the death of a city. And what made him monstrous wasn't passion, it was composure. Amalric believed in divine math, that a soul lost wrongly on earth could still be sorted in heaven, that murder, if wrapped in the right liturgy, could become grace. He didn't whisper orders in the dark. He stood above it all, visible, accountable, proud. He believed he had done exactly what God required. Nothing more, nothing less. But what if he was wrong? That's the twist history never dares say aloud. What if the man who claimed to speak for God was never heard by him at all? What if Béziers was not a necessary cleansing, but a silence so loud it drowned even heaven? No heretic ever wrote a scripture like that. No Cathar ever summoned that kind of fire. It wasn't rebellion that lit the pyres, it was obedience. It was men like Amalric who turned divine ambiguity into command, who stood at the edge of theology and rewrote the word mercy to mean elimination. He would go on to live, to write, to lead. While Béziers became dust, he became a model for how to burn with conviction and walk away righteous. And maybe that's the real horror, that history doesn't always crucify its villains. Sometimes it canonizes them. Béziers didn't fall because it was weak. It didn't fall because it was heretical. It fell because it stood still. Because in a world twisting faith into weapon, choosing not to betray your neighbor became the ultimate crime. The flames that swallowed its churches weren't foreign. They were lit by hands wearing crosses, by men who believed that righteousness could be measured in ash, who believed that the absence of certainty was more dangerous than 1,000 swords. And perhaps they were right. What happened in Béziers was not an accident. It was a formula, a holy precedent. Because once the church saw that a city could be erased in a single breath of fire, without rebellion, without trial, without resistance, it learned that truth could be burned and still be called divine. This wasn't the first crusade soaked in contradiction. It wouldn't be the last. Years before Béziers, there were others who waged holy war under a darker sky. Crusaders who tore into foreign lands in the name of salvation, only to leave behind smoke and sorrow. Some never came home, others brought the fire back with them. And later, another king would take up the cross, chasing glory, chasing God, only to lose himself along the way. These are not stories of saints. These are the stories of faith, fractured and flaming. And if Béziers taught us anything, it's that hell can wear a halo. So if you've made it this far, good. Because this fire stretches far beyond Béziers. It reaches across centuries, across kingdoms, into deserts, into cathedrals, into thrones and broken oaths. Watch what came before and what came after. Let the smoke lead you. And if this is your first time stepping into the shadows with us, welcome. There are many more to walk through. Subscribe to the channel, stay with the fire, and we'll show you what they buried. See you in the next execution.